Hi, everybody. It's always quite awkward when things begin to stream and then nobody's sure. And then you see live on Facebook and you're like, what is happening? And there's like no music playing. So like, I really understand why people do the things that they do to make like live events work, you know? It's quite something. Um, I don't know. Could somebody from the Goethe-Institut come on and let us know how long you'd like us to wait before we begin? Because we're already live and recording, so it makes things very awkward if we all just kind of switch off our videos and mics and keep quiet.
Hello, Dr. Njoki Ngumi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. My name is James. I'm the one doing the technical stuff behind the scenes.
Thank you so much, James.
Yes. So I think now would be a good time to start.
Okay.
Yes. Karibu
Okay,
sana.
we just kind of dive in. There's something so unceremonious about it. It's
Yes.
like take us to dinner time.
Mm.
Um, all right.
Yeah, but thank
Um,
you. Thank you everyone for joining. Feel welcome and let's enjoy this meeting.
um, I guess at this point in time, I'll take the role of welcoming us because we don't have anybody who's officially representing the Gotia here right now. Um, and so I'll just kind of hold space for that and say thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on a very random weekday evening to have a very interesting conversation about these issues that we usually meet to have. We've had the object movement dialogue since the very inception of the International Inventories Programme, and we've really enjoyed everything that has come with engaging with the public about this issue, kind of seeing what are the changing feelings about these things, what are the interesting debates that are coming up, kind of touching base on all of these things, hearing out all these different arguments and letting members of the audience riff off different thoughts, especially after we've had from people who are working in this arena in different contexts. And it's been really interesting to have all these conversations. We've, of course, had to take a very long hiatus because of COVID-19 and the issues as regards meeting in public. But then meeting digitally has become very interesting because that means we can have guests from outside Nairobi, and that's one thing that we're particularly interested to have, and especially today, we have our very first international guest at an OMD, who is a member of our panel, Olivia Windham Stewart. Thank you so much, Olivia, for joining us. Um, we're also super thrilled to begin this journey again, with the knowledge that there's so many more people that are coming up and working in this arena. And of course, one of them is Open Restitution Africa, who are very ably represented here by Chao Maina, who's also a member of our panel today. Thank you so much, Chao, for joining us. And we would kind of, I guess, like to begin the fifth object movement dialogues. It's quite odd and interesting to not have an audience gathered and have the music playing and everybody kind of murmuring quietly and sipping their drinks and settling down as we begin. But then times have changed and we have to change along with them. And so we're super thrilled to just kind of begin the conversation today. Today, we decided that we wanted to talk about the idea of what imperialism has meant in the context of these objects going away, and the last four object movement dialogues, because this is the fifth one, have been focused on us ourselves as the people who lost objects and with them lost very valuable. We've lost lives. We've lost very valuable resources. We do not have access to, of course, the data and the archives and the records of the loss of these resources, even though those data do exist, at least in part, because several of them were, of course, destroyed when independence was won by the Kenyans who asked for it relentlessly from the period of time when colonialism began. And so today, what we are interested in kind of exploring is what these things look like when seen from the other side. And we were particularly interested in exploring the point of view from Britain, the United Kingdom, as it were, who are the holders of the Commonwealth, as it were, such as it is. And as Kenya is a former British colony, we do have an ongoing relationship, however one would want to describe it, with the UK, with the whole thinking around these issues, and with the fact that there's so many of our things on that side that need to come back here, and that there's so much knowledge that isn't flowing the way it should. Because if everybody knows all about the colonialist and everything that the colonialists did, the colonized know these things, but in very many ways, the colonizer is not as aware. The descendants of the colonizer and the people who have reaped the benefits of the colonizer's wealth are also blissfully unaware of everything that it has taken for things to be as they are. The world is as it is for reasons, and I guess those reasons are some of the things that we'll be diving into today. And for this, I would really like to welcome my two guests, both of who work together on an incredible project called the Museum of British Colonialism, which is an entity dedicated to engaging publics and engaging everybody on the fact that British colonialism did happen. There are records of this, there are objects to represent this, there are ideas that need to be presented to the public in order to let them know that this happened, particularly, of course, to the British publics, but also in general in the world, that you cannot have a story that speaks to empire without also knowing what the cost of that empire was. And that's essentially what this project is about. And it's really lovely to have with us Olivia Windham Stewart and Chao Maina, who are co-founders of this incredible project, which they will tell us a little bit more about as we proceed. And I guess I would like to start with Chao, whose work has been in history for as long as ever, and has been kind of branching into the arena of digital histories, digital archives, and is now working across borders to make sure that some of these very important conversations are had. And I wanted to know from you, Chao, could you tell us a little bit about what made you excited about this particular arena of work, and kind of what drew you to the genesis of the idea that would then become the Museum of British Colonialism?
Thank you, Njoki, and thank you to everyone who's watching from around the world. With regards to what drew me to this kind of work, I think the main thing that brought me to the space I'm working in today is access. I was thinking about access and how I accessed history. And how I actually began was writing a blog. I'd go to the Kenya archives, go to the Macmillan Library, and if I'd find something interesting, I'd write about it, take a few photos and share. But what I didn't anticipate was the reaction I would get from other people who were accessing these histories online for the first time. So it's not that these histories weren't there, it's just that they weren't accessible. And at that point, I began to understand that, you know, in the role of public history and public audiences, there was very little information about our history, but particularly about things that were of interest or things that happened, even though they were little facts or photographs. But archives were inaccessible. There's very little public engagement from the public institutions which hold the records. And so in my capacity as a student or as an individual, to be able to have a basic website that people would follow and people would relate to had a huge impact on my understanding of the potential for digital histories to change how we engage, to change how we participate, to change how we dialogue around our history, and to give us a sense of agency and a level of agency that we didn't have before. So the idea of the Museum of British Colonialism was really about access and bringing to the forefront histories which are not known, which are not understood, which are silenced, and being able to participate, participate by sharing our experiences, participate by documenting the history, participate by asking people to join us, participation, access, and primarily looking at the narratives that were right in front of us, but were still hidden. So it's been an interesting journey, particularly looking at digital, particularly looking at our role as young people, because we're approaching this subject as learners. Yeah, I'm not approaching it as an expert. I'm approaching it as someone who doesn't know, not as someone who knows. And I think being open about that process and saying we're a bunch of guys working and learning, join us, has had a really huge impact. And perhaps Olivia could speak to that from the UK end, and I'll continue to speak to it from the Kenya end as we move along.
Thank you so much, Chao, for giving us that kind of primer into being a person that chose a topic and just kind of entered the thing and decided to just kind of ride with it and go where it goes. History has been quite a touchy topic, and we've seen a couple of people who are interested in just kind of approaching it as this grand unchangeable, where somebody doesn't necessarily want to critique the things that they find. They just want to be able to present them to the public in this kind of pristine way, and they resist the idea of having an opinion about these histories, or having an opinion about the ways in which they are represented in these histories. And I wanted to find out from you, what's your take on the idea of being partisan around the things that you find that maybe you are not prepared for, that could be particularly emotional, and things that then really put us in a place that is difficult?
I think for me, my perspective is that history is a very active thing. It's not a passive subject. It's not a subject that we just consume. It's something that we actually have something to give. And if we look at the way history is written and how it's produced, it often has an agenda. It's not neutral. Yeah. So the idea that you cannot have an opinion means that you're accepting someone else's opinion. It's not, your lack of opinion means that you're actually just readily accepting what someone has done. And in the way that we approach this history and we challenge it, for me, it's a very personal endeavor. It's one that's emotional, it's one that's intellectual, it's one that's physical, and it's one that is involving my being, because this is a history that is involving it. This is a history that dictates my reality. And I think when you look at the history of colonialism in Kenya, I would say that it's invisibly visible. You know, it's in everything. It's in the street names, it's in the architecture, it's in the police system, it's in the secondary school system, but somehow managed to camouflage into everything and not appear as if it is of a colonial rooting. So when we begin to unpack this, we see that it affected how I go to school. It affects me when I meet the police. It affects me when I go into town. So I have a role to play in understanding how it affects me. And I think being vulnerable about this process, whether it's emotionally or intellectually, allows us to see the opinions that were hidden. You know, allows us to see the narratives that were kept from us, because it's this same emotion and this same personal history and memory that has played a role in making sure the history is only seen from one side. So if I'm all for vulnerability, I'm all for emotion, I'm all for participation within this sense, because I believe the impact is beyond understanding. It goes into how you relate, how you see yourself in the world, and how you challenge the systems that you live in, you know, essentially.
I think maybe before I hop over to Olivia, the thing that would be really interesting to ask you is that what is the difference in engaging history as an interested student who is guiding your own study vis-a-vis engaging it in school with the kind of agendas? Because again, it's interesting to think about history as an opinion of what happened in time. And then when you think a lot about curricula, and especially history curricula, those become a second layer of opinion of what somebody thinks you should know about what happened prior. And so what do you find when you enter histories and start looking for gaps when it is you now who is in charge of the agenda, and it is you now who is kind of forming it, in this kind of spirit of imagining beyond imperialism, because imperialism was the agenda of the historian of what we are told is world history. And again, the maintenance of this imperialism is often the agenda of curriculum makers. And so when you enter as somebody who does not have those interests at heart and is interested in engaging history from the point of somebody who was often erased from these histories, especially as a Black person, as a woman, what do you find? What are the gaps? What are the interesting surprises? What do you find waiting for you there when you enter into the ocean by yourself?
Wow, it's a big question, but I think I'll say you begin by, you feel like you're drowning. You essentially feel like you're drowning because it's so overwhelming, just the amount of information that was in front of you, but you just didn't know. And after, you're kicking and you're trying to stay afloat, and you surrender to the process and you see, okay, I'm finding an understanding of myself. And for me, what it has given me a lot of empathy. And for myself as an African, for myself as a Black woman, because we grow up feeling like we are wrong, you're poor, you're corrupt, there's this. So you grow up with so much negativity around your identity. And when you encounter these histories and you encounter these questions, you begin to understand why. So for me, what I find is the why. And what the why gives me is, it allows me to move forward. So how do I move forward? But that critical point when it just clicks, like, this is why, so much starts to make sense. And I believe even when you're problem solving and debugging, you need to understand why. What is the problem? Why are we experiencing it? And then you move to the how. So for me, it's the understanding of the why. It gives me an understanding of myself, of my people, but also the empathy to be able to deal with the problems that are facing me today. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chao, and we'll come back to you at a little point later after we've had a bit of a conversation with Olivia. Olivia, thank you so much for joining us, especially at such short notice. Of course, we were supposed to have Dan Hicks here with us, but then he had to pull out quite urgently at the last minute with multiple apologies. And we're so glad we were able to have you on hand to kind of give us your time at such short notice. And so first, allow us to thank you so much and communicate how honored we are that you were able to join us so quickly.
Thank you for having me. I mean, it's an honor. I'm no Dan Hicks, so it's a big honor to join you. And I just hope that, it's so interesting. I always love doing things with Chao. Obviously, we're sort of, like to collaborate together. So thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I guess maybe a place to begin, and one of the things that we know that Kenyans are always curious about, especially the vast majority of us who studied under our own kind of local school system, where we learned Kenyan history, was to kind of start understanding from a British perspective, what do British people learn about history? Because like for us, we had to learn about history from the point of view of people who were colonized, and so there's a flavor that it comes with. There's facts that you learn. There's ideas that you learn, and that of course all of this knowledge is distilled from the tomes, which of course were distilled from the agendas that Chao and I were discussing earlier. But when we think about it from a British perspective, what exactly are British children being taught about how Britain came to be Britain, about what the Commonwealth is rooted in, and what's common, quote unquote, about it? What do things look like coming from that side?
Sure. Sorry, first of all, it gets a bit noisy in the background, and there are often sirens, so sorry about that. But so, I mean, it's interesting just hearing you talk about education and where we come to find knowledge, because I mean, I genuinely feel like my historical education only really started after school. I feel as though it only really started in my 20s. What I learned at school were the very well-known, well-worn, solid facts that we like to talk about, that we like to discuss. that tend to show Britain in quite a strong light and tend to orientate themselves around power and polarity and the world wars and the defeat of Hitler and Russia and China and the threat of other cultures, and sort of British triumph. I think there's with the benefit of hindsight, of course, there is an ever-growing recognition, you know, amongst younger communities now that that's not going to equip people to understand the way that the world really works. So I think that there's a very inspiring movement now to revisit the curriculum, but that simultaneously comes up against a bit of a conservative crackdown on what is acceptable to talk about in the classroom, which includes an avoidance of victim narratives, an avoidance of any critique of capitalism. You know, there's a very strong push to kind of maintain the status quo. So the two things are kind of rising together, which is not unusual. So, I mean, my motivation for doing this work is really because I felt such a profound ignorance and such a profound lack of rigorous education, because there is no imperial lens to the education that we have, even though it is obviously imperial because it's all about Britain's greatness and how the rest of the world just doesn't do it quite right. But there's not the kind of true rigorous nature that you would really need to understand. And like Chao says, once you kind of get that, once you get that lens and put it on, it helps you more or less understand everything. Yeah.
You said something super interesting about the idea that it's all over and yet it's not there at all. And that kind of mirrors almost exactly what Chao said about how history is always hiding everywhere. It's hiding in street names. It's hiding in the layout of the way the street is arranged. It's hiding in the fact that if you go to African capitals that were colonized by the British, the cities feel familiar, even though you're not necessarily quite sure why they do. History is hiding in all of those places. And the thing that you said is about how imperialism is hiding in all of these things, even when it is not named, even when it is when it is not called out, even when it is not defined. And you find that that's one of power's most successful strategies, to kind of hide and be completely invisible in plain sight, and push itself as this is how things are, this is how things have always been, this is how things engage as normal. And so for me, I'm really interested in, like, what do you think your kind of pivot point was as a person that kind of made you realize, wait, the world doesn't work the way I was told that it works, and I absolutely need to turn around in this moment and find out why it doesn't do that? Because a lot of times those pivot moments for many people can be very overwhelming, kind of like that kind of matrix, blue pill, red pill moment, with of course knowledge of the problematics of the analogy in this time, etc. But then that foundational choice to just kind of dive into the gap, when do you think that choice was made for you?
I can think of like a few key moments in my life where you kind of have these seismic shifts and you think, like, oh my gosh, the world will never look the same again. I didn't know, and I can't believe there was a me before the me that now knows. I think that I have always been very interested in the arts and culture. When I left school, I started to think more about how those things are structured, who's been left out, who's defining what we learn. That was a very important moment for me, more kind of critical theory. And then I moved more into political and social justice issues and more theory around that. So reading, just exploring my own curriculum, reading Black authors and philosophers and politicians, and understanding the kind of different power dynamics, just getting a completely different, I went to, it's a kind of classic thing to do in the UK, but I went to SOAS, which gives you a completely different lens to the one that you might get at school. Because it's very grounded in critical theory. And then I think in terms of this history, the key thing for me has been visiting so many countries and being in so many countries that were former colonies, because that's when I truly understood how things are really seen. And the reason for that is because I work in supply chains. So my job is a business and human rights specialist, and the structures of that are very imperial, because supply chains continue to go. It's the reason countries were colonized in the first place. Supply chains continue to go into colonies and extract wealth from them. And there is a very, very extreme lack of awareness and knowledge about how colonialism basically just morphed into a kind of, capitalism. And not that much has changed. And I felt like it was not even responsible or okay to be working in countries and trying to figure out social justice issues now in terms of trade and development and how supply chains work and how you can kind of address matters of economic exploitation now, unless I had a better understanding of how these systems came into being in the first place and which dynamics prevail and which dynamics don't prevail, which are few. So that was a really big moment for me. And I think it's because it's not so much about being taught, it's just about listening. So being in countries and just hearing what people who aren't my British English teachers were saying about the relationship of certain countries to Britain now and previously, it was like mind-blowing. I mean, I just didn't know. And then all of a sudden, the world just looked quite upside down. And that was an incremental thing. But as you say, there are also certain moments where you really get to know how the world works. And it's always quite depressing. But, that's what happens. So at least then you feel more equipped to think about how you can actually create change in different arenas. So I try to do it in my day job, and I try to also address it in the kind of cultural space that has always been very important to me, and a space where I went to learn things. So I felt like I had gone to these places to learn things and I had been deceived, and I'd gone to school to learn things and I had been deceived. And the only way to really get truth was through listening and talking and understanding things from another perspective, which wasn't the one that I was getting in school or in our cultural institutions.
You've used a very, very interesting word, and it's such an active term, which is deception. Like the idea that we have to be deceived that the world works one particular way, and then you just kind of go out into real life and find that things are completely different. And that really frames, school and or the academy as a place that is deeply complicit in passing along narratives that are convenient for certain power structures to continue as they are, to continue unchallenged. Because then if you learn that this is what normal is, then normal begins to be able to hide in plain sight, like we were saying, as regards the history of colonization in Kenya and the history of imperialism in the UK. And that word then becomes really interesting for us to kind of carry into the next inquiry, which is kind of about what then was, because the search for truth seems to be at the root and seems to be the seed of the Museum of British Colonialism, because the Museum of British Colonialism as a phrase is a fact. It is a fact about a fact, and it is the choice to showcase that fact and to interrogate the fact that there was no museum quite yet that was so deliberate and so intentional and so explicit about this thing that was kind of hiding in plain sight in multiple places. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, what the galvanizing around that truth has been to the beginning of the institution.
Yeah, it's a good thing to pick up on, because I do feel deceived, we're all being deceived constantly. It's kind of the only way people can get society to keep functioning as it does without everyone losing their minds. So it has been a truth-seeking mission. And as Chao has said, we've approached it as people who fundamentally don't know but want to know. So we are trying to educate ourselves and trying to educate ourselves alongside each other. and the kind of positioning of the just to put it out there and say, we can just put out the idea of a Museum of British Colonialism to draw attention to exactly what you say, which is just the absence that you don't even notice until somebody points it out. But so imperialism is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere to be seen. So it's in all of our museums, in all of our cultural institutions, and yet absent in the sense that we don't actually have a dedicated space to deal with the most significant thing that frames and shapes our society now. So it kind of came to me as something that was absent and we could put into the world, as something that we could create as we went along on our journey to learn about things that happened. And it's inherently not an object space, because it's not about collecting objects to tell stories. It's about going on a journey to understand history and share it. And that widens access, as Chao has said, and it just kind of brings people along on that journey. So it's also questioning what the purpose of a museum is in the first place. So it's kind of an idea that you can pivot around and like look at in different ways and think about in different ways. But I hope simultaneously calls a few things into question, like absence and cultural institutions in general, and what belongs in spaces as we learn and how we learn, and you know, how we collaborate to get at the truth, because I don't think you can get at the truth on your own. I couldn't have got at the truth on my own. I just don't think it's possible. So it's really that space for people to come to and do that work together. It's an emotional space, as Chao said. It's kind of it's an emotional space as well.
I really love what you've said about truth as a group project, you know, and that in the same way that this grand deception has been a group project for generations, and so many people have been co-opted into continuing to propagate it. And so then it cannot be one individual who kind of stands up and says that they're gonna rage against the machine and that they'll be able to topple it by themselves. And so there's also a kind of nostalgic deception in the idea of the story of the one hero who goes and does the one thing, when the reality is that life is much more about groups of people kind of pushing back against other groups, and narratives, fighting against other narratives in this kind of group work way. I guess maybe one of the things to just let our audiences know, both here on Zoom and on Facebook, that you can please put your questions in the comment box below the video, and then the questions will come this way. Please ask Olivia and Chao any questions that you may have, and then those questions will come this way and we'll be able to answer them in the course of the evening. I guess maybe this is the point in time at which I kind of make the questions go to both of you, and we'll just kind of cycle between the two of you as we answer them. And it would also be interesting to see if you have opinions that kind of slightly differ, or that look at the question from a completely different space. And the first question, of course, has to do with the idea of the museum not as a collection of objects, which is the first step to imagining beyond imperialism. Because beforehand, if we think about museum, the museum has been such an imperial project to kind of like a large show and tell, where you kind of take all these things from all these people and then say, look, I have all these things, come and see all of the things that I have. And then you hire people to kind of put the things in different types of collections and say, look at the things, we are now collecting them in this way. And then in two months' time, it's look at these different groups of things again that we brought out from the store. We are now framing them in this way, kind of ad infinitum. But then if we look at your idea for what a museum can be, which first of all is post-object, and is now saying that we are actually a museum for truths, we are a museum for facts, we are a museum for questions, we are a museum for introspection and insights. And so could you tell us about that kind of process and how it sits in this general search for truth that you're kind of working in? And I guess we can start with you, Chao.
Oh wow! I mean, it's interesting that you raise a question of a museum and it being a space devoid of objects. What does that look like? And for me, if I look at if I go back to, the traditional form of preserving history within many African societies, being oral history. And when I look at the dynamics of that, I look at it and I think, what does it mean when everyone is responsible for history? In oral history, she knows, he knows, everyone has that responsibility. But what we do when we now move into this space of what we know as museums is that we say these people have the responsibility, this institution. We make it about a particular group of people, whereas I think in the way that we looked at history traditionally was that it was a collective responsibility. It was my role, it was your role, it was my sister's role. Everyone needed to know how, and everyone needed to know why. So I think this disruption in how history is formed, is told, how it's memorialized, leaves us feeling very lost. Yeah. So when we talk about people knowing, I think awareness in itself is a goal. Oftentimes people will ask, when are you going to build a museum? Do you have objects? Do you have physical spaces? But I think to myself, and I think the process of awareness itself is one that spreads seeds. You're planting seeds in different minds, you're planting seeds in different facets, and each of those seeds will grow in its own way. So the way we look at the museum as awareness, as a place of awareness, but as a place where that awareness can translate into change. And the optics of it, of us being two young women in different parts of the world with little resources and actually doing the work, I think that in itself is also a statement, because someone can say, if Chao can do it, I think pretty much I can. So it's not just in what we're talking about. I think it's the possibilities we're opening up and the opportunities we're opening up. So when I look at the museum moving forward, yes, it's a place of it can have objects, but what awareness are we creating? How does the awareness translate to impact? And what possibilities are you giving your audience? What do they leave there knowing, So I think maybe Olivia would have a different perspective, but for me, I think the awareness, the possibilities and the opportunities to show that you can participate and you can contribute, you can question, is the impact that we maybe subconsciously didn't think we would like to see, but as we go on, it's very fulfilling. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the reflection on history as a shared responsibility, and as a collective enterprise. It's obviously different in the UK. History has not been viewed like that. History has been a history of, at school, largely kind of kings and queens, and power, and museums and objects are about power. So if people like Chao and I pipe up and say, actually, we feel deceived and we think we can do a better job educating people without any objects and without any bequeathed, recognized institutional power, then can everybody do this? And can everybody participate? Because we are not ordained with any special powers. We just have time and the motivation to do it. And we've always tried to keep it completely open, and make sure that we do have a sense of that shared responsibility, which will never be imbued in an object, because that's not where the power is. It's in the process. The power is in the process. The museum is in the process. Like, everyone's like, where is the museum? I'm like, the museum lives. It's here. It's in this Zoom call. This is it. This is what we have. Okay. But in that process, you change things. It's just like little molecular changes, because people become more aware and more aware. And then people start to look at objects and look at institutions and think about power differently. And that, to me, is like more radical than a collection,
I really love what he said about the museum lives, and it kind of had a little Frankenstein moment.
It feels like that. It feels like Frankenstein. What have we started?
and I think in like kind of moving from the idea of the museum moving from being walls and objects to being people and process, is also moving from the museum being the story that is told to you by the people who have custodianship over the objects, to being a conversation between peoples who see the same story very differently. And one of the most interesting things about the Museum of British Colonialism continues to be the fact that it is people on both sides of a very violent story choosing to come and see how they can tell that story again for the people to hear it from both perspectives very, very, very intentionally. And maybe you could both tell us a little bit about what that process has looked like and continues to feel like for both of you, because for both of you, history is a living thing. And so you are also living beings encountering a living history, which lives without, it lives without censorship. It is facts, in the same way that we were talking about earlier. These things happened, and we meet them as the descendants of their happening, of the agents of the happening, or of the people who had to live in the aftermath of its happening. And so how do you see this way of engaging with truth, where instead of people pushing one agenda, we're pushing a collective story forward in ways that people haven't really been familiar with before? And maybe we can start with you, Olivia, and then go to Chao afterward.
Sure. I think that the engagement, for me, is the thing. It is and has always been the thing, because the experiences and the stories can't be confined to a space or a single narrative. It's a systemic, long-term thing that has shaped everything we are, and the way we interact with each other and the way the world kind of functions. So the idea of confining that to a space or some objects, yes, they could maybe help in the narrative, but these are people's experiences. So it really has to become a space where everyone is welcome and everybody can contribute and reflect. And there are more aggressive ways to approach, you can get angry about, you should be angry about everything. I'm angry. It's angry making what has happened historically, what happens now. It's angry making. But for me, it's important personally, and different people in the museum group may feel differently about this, but it's important for me that we try to bring our understanding together. It's always going to be different. But my feeling at the start of this was that, like, there's a understanding and a narrative over here in Kenya or in Burma or in Bangladesh, and there's one over here, and they are worlds apart. And that is just never going to help anyone, because we're talking about things that have happened that people do not have any shared feelings about. And people may never, but I think it's very important that that interaction exists. So you try and bring an understanding as much as you can. So without wanting to sound too like kumbaya about it, like, I do also see it as a potential space for truth and reconciliation, in that sense, where you can really get into it and really be real about it and accept your position and listen, and then hopefully your position will change as you listen and as you understand those things. Certainly I would hope that your feeling about the kind of contemporary world would change along with that. And so that's always been the kind of crux of the project. Rather, it's not just a question of kind of people coming individually and like looking around an exhibition then leaving. It's about people coming together because we're all affected, we're all in this, whether we like it or not. So that's what it's really been about for me. And that's why it's always been kind of essential that we work in this way, and we understand that this isn't just a kind of, it's not going to be a London building with like ticking the boxes of what we want to talk about imperialism. It's actually an open space.
I think Olivia has talked about engagement and the interaction as being a really core part. Another thing that I see as a core part of the museum and the group in itself is the ability to circumvent and just, you know, exist beyond borders. Because in as much as, you know, we're digital and the things that can happen, we are still tied to physical locations, you know. So for me, the archives are in London. I'm in Nairobi, the archives are in London. For Olivia, the archives are in London, but the oral histories are in Kenya, you know. So I think it's really been about saying, what do we also have in our environments? And how do we bring this together? How do we bring these disparate sources, different views together, both in what they represent, but also in how we as physical beings in physical locations access them? And does the museum create a central place in which whatever is in London and whatever is in Nairobi are sort of, you know, collated and come together in an interesting way? And that's what we try to do with our work. And anything that we produce is greatly tied to the physicality of colonialism and in the structures in which it reveals itself. But moving, I would say maybe taking the power out of that obscurity and, you know, the benefits of when you don't know something or you've never experienced something, then it's so easy to block it, you know, just to ignore it, you know. But what we're saying is, see this is in Nyeri, this is in Hounslow Park, see it and recognize it and map it. So I think challenging those structures of just barriers and the physical structures of colonialism and trying in a way to challenge them and to bring them together in a digital space has been quite an interesting, and we're still learning, but it has been a really interesting way to challenge these narratives and to exist, as you're saying, beyond borders, beyond imperialism.
Yeah, I think there's just one thing I want to add to that, which I was just thinking as Chao was speaking, which is that for me, something significant that was missing was a visual recall, because not even a recall, a visual lexicon of what did colonialism look like. Because it obviously it manifests in the material world. If you say to me the Second World War or Auschwitz or the Russian gulags, I have a visual memory of this, which is more important to me than an object, because I carry it with me and it informs my view of the world. And when I first heard about Kenya and the Mau Mau emergency, I had no visual material for that. I didn't know what it looked like. I couldn't picture it. I had never seen pictures of Black people, of Kenyans in detention centres. I had not seen the barbed wire. I didn't know what Mweru looked like. And it's about helping to create a visual memory and a visual understanding that's not object-based, but is essential to the way we understand the world, and is also essential to kind of a lot of the racist structures, because a lot of visual memory that we're given in the UK is racially informed. So we're given visual memory about white experiences in history, and we're not given visual understandings of Black experiences in history. And that will affect your perception. So it's trying to kind of create that internal vision without having physical objects that get brought into a collection.
I think another really interesting point to note is how women-driven the Museum of British Colonialism is. And in histories, traditionally, obviously, because histories have been nation-state histories, they've been histories of war, and those things are very, very patriarchally defined, mediated, treasured, worshipped, and carried forward. And it's really interesting to then see that the people who are kind of carrying the standard forward about how to look at these things differently in a new way tend to be women very much across the board, who also go back into history to look for themselves, because in the same way that you're discussing how Black people are written out of imperial histories, you find that women are written out of global human histories, aside from being people that bring forth the next generation, for those whose bodies are involved in this process. And so it would be interesting to hear from you what you're kind of seeing as regards the engagement, particularly from women, not just on this topic, but in general about how histories have been framed and how they feel they want histories to be framed moving forward.
Chao, would you like to go first? Let the sirens go from the back.
I think for me, looking at the impact, I'll go back to the question of possibility. And in the demonstration of possibility, what that does for someone else. And the beautiful thing about, working within digital spaces and having that unmediated access to platforms and to dissemination is that we're seeing many, like, if I look, for example, at the accounts online that are curating Kenyan history, many of them are run by women. If I look at Open Institution Africa, the Women's History Museum Zambia, if I look at what is happening in Ghana with Nana and she's doing the mobile museum. So it speaks, I think, to the possibility, but also to the opportunity and the vision. What it creates for me, it creates for someone else. And I think the power that has for us to bring to the forefront narratives that we didn't know. So for example, before I started working with MBC, I didn't know that my great-grandmother was in a detention camp. And this is only a history that I've come across, through MBC, but also having to reach back into my own past and say, this relates to me in ways that I didn't know, and for example, we've known this history. My grandfather, Hassan, was aware of it, but he never spoke about it until, much recently when I said, okay, Guya, I'm working on this. Could you tell me more about it? And that's when he opened up, so I look at it in a very, maybe it's poetic, but, for me to be able to tell her story 2-3 generations removed is a continuation of that. Why was she in a detention camp? What did she experience? I am seeing myself, but I'm also seeing her. And I think when women are working in histories, we relate and we're able to see the unseen or the ignored or the silenced. And it really is a powerful thing.
Yeah, I think I agree. There is something to be said for how women are operating in the historical space, without wanting to kind of labor some gender stereotypes. I mean, there are different ways of engaging with history. There is a very cerebral way of engaging, which is very fact-based and very clear-cut. And there is an emotional, psychological way of engaging. There is being comfortable with admitting that you don't know, which is not something that is perhaps equally distributed across the genders. And there is a willingness and an enthusiasm to go there emotionally, which is not something that is encouraged in men. Women are encouraged to get together and talk and to go there emotionally and to be able to admit that we don't know. Men are less encouraged to do that. They are encouraged to present their knowledge. And that has been how it has been historically. This is changing massively, of course, and nobody is kind of bound to this, but it is notable that there are women who are willing to go there. And I think that's part of what Chao and I are kind of open to doing.
I just want to encourage the people that are watching, both here on Zoom and on Facebook, to please put your questions in whichever comment box is nearest to you, and we'll be able to get to them. Please ask Chao and Olivia questions about the work that they've been doing, the things that we've been discussing here today. I think in this kind of space where imperialism is a defined thing, and so imagining beyond it then becomes the task of people who do not want to live by its rules and under its deception anymore. How can we use the platforms that we have to engage publics much more intentionally about these topics that are really already alive so much in our everyday? I think it's become quite trite to be able to say we have a digital space, you just put things online and people will find them. But then how can we become a little bit more intentional about building communities around these topics, around building knowledge beyond kind of one-time interactions, or beyond like this one very pithy viral meme or post that then gets everybody like, wow, okay, this thing was really cool, and then the momentum dies. And so we have a lot of these kind of peak, very acute moments that then people ride between. How do we figure out a way to kind of enact a curriculum intention to then kind of shift the ways in which people are learning some of these things? Maybe we can start with you, Chao, and then go to Olivia.
I was really hoping you'd say start with Olivia. But maybe when Olivia speaks, I'll have more to say. But off the top of my head, I think for me, when I look at digital spaces, I truly believe that they should also be spaces of empathy. And when we're speaking about histories and we're producing content, how are we building empathy? You know, how does the audience relate to this content? One of the things that we've been doing is we've been doing like 3D reconstructions of camps and trying to have like a very visual, very interactive nature for people to understand how these camps looked. But the other side of it is that when you come up with this digital renders in void spaces, they're empty. You know, they lack the emotion, they lack the connection, they lack the story. So what we're trying to do within this aspect, for instance, as an example, is that we're trying to see how do we incorporate the oral histories into this digital spaces. You know, when I present the 3D models, how do I make sure that there's an audio experience with it attached to it, that you can understand not only the structure itself, but the people who are held in this structure. So building empathy within content, especially digital content, is in my view, and what we've been doing in with the museum, a very big way for audiences to understand and keep understanding the nature of the work that we are producing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. I think that the participation in the making is also very important. Nothing we do is ever really necessarily finished. It's just where we are at that time, and everyone's always welcome to get involved, and that will always change. As Chao says, history's active. History's a verb to us, right? It's just something you do, like I history, you history, he, she, it's histories. It's just something we're doing. So it will never be static. And the digital side is very important to access it, to issues of access. It is also, I think COVID has shown us, like, real world engagement, there is no substitute for it. How we do that going forward, I don't know. None of us know. If I knew, then, you know, I'd be some sort of soothsayer. Nobody knows where this is going, but I think that finding ways to continue to bring people together in the process will always be important. I love being with Chao in real life. Chao and I have sat here and like had good times and had good ideas, and it's great to be on Zoom together, but you know, you do also need to find ways to bring people together in real life and fold people in, you know, and bring people into the mix so that the work becomes more meaningful and more layered. So in that sense, I guess it's just a question of kind of continuing the process, and bringing people into that process, because that's the thing for us.
Yeah, and just to add to what Olivia said, I think we won't get to a point where this work is done. It will always continue. You know, there is no destination and there actually is no ending. You know, you do what you can in the ways that you can, and you know, someone will continue or someone will find it. So this idea that we can have an end to this discussion, scratch it. You know, it will always manifest in different ways. But what's important is the process and the understanding that the process has to be intentional. As intentional as the outcome that you desire, that the process is an equal part of that process.
I guess before we get to the questions from the audience, and there's one rather lovely question that's just come in, and I'll kind of read it out and have you guys engage with it. I think maybe the last question that I'll ask for the purposes of the panel before we get into what the audience are thinking and feeling is there's an idea, there's a hypothesis that in order to change things, one needs quote unquote critical mass. So you need like a critical mass of people who know a certain thing, or you need a critical mass of people who are engaged around a topic, or maybe for a critical period of time. And so I wanted to know, from the point of view of MBC, is that true? If it is, what does critical mass look like? If it is not, what is an alternative narrative to getting the numbers of people seeing and challenging this kind of grand scale deception that we were talking about earlier?
Chao, you went first last time, so I'll I'll go first now. I think more is better. The more people we engage, the better. We do our best. We're volunteers. We give the energy we have. We would love as many people as possible in as many different countries with as many different experiences and perspectives to engage in our work, even if they don't like it. Of course, that would always be where we would like to be. Saying that, what we've got is good. You know, it's we keep going. We don't have we've got to get to 1 million followers, otherwise we're nobodies. We don't mind. We're just doing the work. If you want to come along. We'd love to welcome you into the process. That's kind of where we sit with that, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think critical mass, especially when you're attempting, or when your mission and your aim is to subvert systems that are dependent on people not knowing, then critical mass is probably, it's protest. You know, it's mental protest. When I know what you've hidden from me, and so knows, you're building a group of people that can use their knowledge to impact or to change, you know. So critical mass is an essential part of what we do, and awareness raising and participation all ties into this idea that reach as many people as possible. As I mentioned, I think in the first question, we're planting seeds, you know, where they'll grow and if they'll grow, we don't know. But the fact that this seed has been planted in a mind that's not mine or Olivia's, it could blossom into a completely different thing. And I think that's what we're aiming for, consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to see how the environment has changed also around us. So people believe things in our work that they would have been skeptical about previously, because people have woken up to what is going on in this world in a lot of ways. So Whereas maybe a few years ago, you'd kind of be like, did you know the British government did X, Y, and Z? People would be like, no, they didn't. That's a QAnon conspiracy theory. We don't believe you. Now they're like, yeah, okay, yeah, structural racism, it's real. So that we exist relationally with other things that are happening in the world, and we interact with that critical mass. We couldn't have done that, but we participate, and that affects the way we interact with people. So that helps us reach a critical mass. So yeah, we'll just kind of keep playing a little role in that bigger movement.
Yeah, I love what both of you have said about movements informing other movements, and then movements being able to kind of catapult off critical mass being arrived at by other related kind of struggles. And that's kind of a very beautiful way to enter into the question, which has come in, which is from Oshun the Goddess. Thank you, Oshun. And the question says, as the only Kenyan and African in a majority white space, anti-racism, I have found myself wondering, how can I use this work within a Kenyan context when we say colonialism and they say slavery, yet the outcome is the same? The subjugation of the Kenyan or African voice, input and intellect in favor of the amplification of the white voice and white narrative. So how can we help Kenyans really understand the depth of the impact of colonialism when its experience is so normalized? I think frankly, Oshun needs to come and join you guys. Like, this is what needs to happen. Because this is like the root question for MBC.
Everything, yeah. Oh, I sigh because I feel that it is a very important question. And as you're saying, Njoki, the root of what we're doing, when we talk about how normalized this is, it's scary. It's very, very scary. And the idea that we are constantly responding to, we're not even starting from a point where we want to understand. We're saying, no, but we're this, but Africans are this. We're always responding to the system, And I think the question is, how do we build our own systems and how do we build our own structures in a way that makes this, I think the first thing I would think of is data. I think we underplay what access to data, access to archives, what impact it has. We have archives that are still in London that I as a Kenyan cannot access. But what if we make this information accessible at all levels? Whether it's within primary school for primary school audiences or secondary school for secondary audiences, then how do we use this data at each stage of our lives? How does this data or these records and this understanding inform different aspects of our lives? Whether I'm an engineer or a nurse, I will encounter racism. No one says engineers, because they are scientists, don't encounter racism. It affects us all, So I think we are working against systems that are very big and very intentional. If you look at how the arts have been devalued, you're told you can't study history, it doesn't pay. It's very intentional. So there's so many factors that are even preventing us from waking up and saying, okay, this is the reality. Whether you're that engineer or that doctor or that teacher, this is your reality. What do you do with it? So I don't even think I have an answer to that at the moment. But I think the process of making the inaccessible accessible is a start towards, I don't know if there's a word called denormalizing, but is a process towards, taking back that power.
Olivia, do you have any thoughts about the question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm white, so it's I cannot respond to tell the questioner what to, how to face that. I can say, as a white person, I try to act consciously in anti-racist ways. I worry about that, but I don't want to use that as an excuse not to, sometimes it's like, oh, I don't know what to do, I can't do anything. Well, we do our best. I'm trying to understand what I don't know, and I'm trying to fill in the blanks. Fill in the Blanks is another like great organization, and I'm talking and understanding and trying to make sure that like we create a space that has room for people's voices. There are default settings in the world because things are propped up by the system, so things will go a certain way if you don't resist them, and it takes effort and intentionality to do that. So that's what we all have to do, and it's everyone's responsibility. So from my perspective, there is a education that needs to happen. You know, it is not the responsibility of everyone who is not white to fix this problem. White is a lot of the problem. So how we act responsibly is a question that we need to continue to ask. And I think that trying to become very aware, and also being as open and honest as possible about where racism is, if you're feeling it, is very important. And I think there's been a huge learning curve in terms of, I mean, people didn't even used to think of white as a race. It was just the norm. And I think now people are aware of being white and acting as white people. So I think there's a change. It hasn't gone far enough. So I don't have an answer to that, but that's just kind of my position in relation to that question.
Thanks, Olivia. There's a second question from Jacob Chao. Thank you, Jacob. And the question reads, hello to you all. Thank you for sharing your insights, really inspiring. Following up on the thought you explored in some detail about the ways that different genders are interacting with the urgent work of deconstructing oppressive structures. To my mind, the vast majority of museum conservators do tend to be women, which is an interesting thought to explore in and of itself, perhaps touching on the similarities of conservation of objects and observation of ecosystems, memories, and histories, which tend to be similarly skewed towards women. How do you think these two ways of engaging with history can interact with each other, with one urge being to conserve and the other to deconstruct? And then he says, I'm sorry, it's a very abstract question.
Chao, do you want to say, so just to be clear on the question.
Yeah.
The questioner is asking about conservation and deconstruction.
Yes,
and
he says to his mind, the vast majority of museum conservators do tend to be women. So I don't know whether if this is anecdotally true or evidentially true, but it's an interesting thought.
I only know a few conservators, and they're women. It's one of the less well-paid roles in the museum world. I mean, you know, in the hierarchy of power and influence in the museum world, I think the conservation, you know, you're not setting the agenda.
No.
You're doing the kind of care work. I know women who do that. I don't know any men who do that. I don't know if the data would bear that out. That's my experience. Chao?
To be honest, I can't speak to the percentage of conservators who are women, but I think also it's very telling if it is true that in the way that women do the core work, you know, but rarely get the recognition. And the conservation is sort of like a back office job. You know, you have front office, this is the people curating and meeting visitors and deciding which things go on exhibition. And you have the people who are working on these objects and conserving them so that they can go on exhibition, who will not get a say or the opportunity to determine that. And I'm not too sure how to speak to it, but I think it's a reflection of the world. It's a reflection of you know, patriarchy as a system. If that is the case, it is a mirror. Whether it's happening, you know, in our homes or in the museum world, it is part of the same system.
I think when Olivia said the thing about the jobs being lower paying, and when you look across all industries or all collections of tasks that people do outside the house that are relatively industrialized. The minute you start looking at, okay, so who isn't being seen, who is doing the bulk of repetitive, very demanding labor, you start to see gendered, you start to see gendered illusion. And then when you also see at the point in time when there are protests, there's a push towards changing at the very beginning of a thing when it is immeasurably difficult, when people are beginning to ask the hard questions and meeting the worst of the pushback, again, you start also seeing some elements of a gendered skew there. So in many ways, I think Jacob's question speaks to what you have so rightly, Chao, described as a mirror, that there's this conservation and there's this deconstruction, and that they are almost the same thing. And if one looks at it in a gendered way, it's possible to see it with a gendered lens, even though, again, one would need evidence in order to confirm it. I don't think there are any more questions, even though those two questions were particularly deep and juicy. Thank you so much, Oshun the Goddess and Jacob Chao, for asking those questions. And I guess maybe the final question that I would ask the two of you is, how can somebody join the Museum of British Colonialism? Because one of the things that you've said is you're a volunteer-run network. You're always kind of looking to see, can a bunch of other people kind of join in and see what they can do? Jacob has kind of has added something to his point, which is that, yes, what Olivia says about conservation being low-paid care work is true, and is one of the many reasons for gender skewing. So Jacob Chao completely agrees with you. Thank you, Jacob, so much for that follow-up. Yes, and we were kind of here at the tail end, where you were going to tell all of the lovely people watching how exactly they can come on board with the Museum of British Colonialism and figure out what they can do to kind of join this incredible work that you guys are doing.
Oh, okay, I'll go ahead. We often joke, I mean, we're trying to be a bit more grown up, but our office really is a WhatsApp group that has been the most valuable tool that has been invented for the purposes of establishing a Museum of British Colonialism. But the way in which we work is that you bring what you can. And when I say you bring what you can, you bring the skills that you have. And it's interesting because people will come and say, I'm an academic, I can do this. I'm a writer, I can do this. I'm a press person, I can do this. So you can write to us. I think it's info@museumofbritishcolonialism.org. And our website is museumofbritishcolonialism.org, and Twitter is Museum of BC. But what you can offer in terms of your skill sets and your understanding, or help us expand what we're doing, then we're absolutely happy to reach back and say, welcome.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Olivia. So please, for the audience, both here on Zoom and live on Facebook, please note that you've been told that on Twitter and on Instagram, they are at Museum of BC. The website is www.museumofbritishcolonialism.org, and the place where you can drop them a line and say, hi, I have this skill, what can I do for the Museum of British Colonialism, would be info@museumofbritishcolonialism.org. There's one person who I think is coming with a question here towards the end, and yes, it's about posting the address on the chat, and yes, the email address has been posted, as well as the Twitter and Instagram handle and the website. Thank you so much, the two of you, for joining us today. Are there any kind of parting or last words that you'd like to share with our audience this evening before we kind of go forth into the night? It's been so interesting, Olivia, to watch kind of night falling.
Yeah, it has actually.
because like for us, you know, we were well into the night when the panel began. But then, like for you, we started during the day, and then we just kind of seeing twilight descend, which is super
perfect. You've taken me just straight into sort of dinner time, so it's a lovely thing for my day as the sun goes down.
Very nice.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us, Njoki, and the team who's facilitated this. Thank you for the opportunity. And we look forward to engaging more online. You can reach us on the handles or write to us. The more the merrier.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you very much. Thanks for bringing me in. It's always so nice to get together and talk about what we're up to. So we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's been an incredible pleasure having you. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for telling us about the incredible work that you're doing with the Museum of British Colonialism. Thank you again, Olivia. I don't think we can really thank you enough for being able to just kind of jump in and hold the fort when we had a bit of an emergency earlier. Thank you so much for joining us on such short notice. Chao, as always, it's always wonderful to speak with you, and we're really looking forward to all of these interesting initiatives of people who are interested in unpacking these horrible, deep deceptions and finding new ways of engaging with truth and gathering people around these new understandings of truth as we go forward, whether it's Open Institution Africa, or whether it's the Museum of British Colonialism, and whether it's IIP, of course, and the several other initiatives like it. We're so grateful to have had you here with us today. Thank you to our audience, both here and live on Facebook, for joining us for the 5th edition of the Object Movement Dialogues, which was titled Imagining Beyond Imperialism. And we're so grateful to Chao Maina and to Olivia Windham Stewart for joining us today and kind of unpacking with us what their imagination beyond imperialism has looked like, and reflecting on the journey of the Museum of British Colonialism and what it's going to look like going forward. That is a forever labor, because we have to continue learning to see histories differently and engaging with them differently as a population and as a society. We want to thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we want to wish you the loveliest evening and a lovely weekend to come, because tomorrow is Friday. So happy Friday, and everybody have a great night. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Njoki Ngumi for the Invisible Inventories Project, and on behalf of everybody on the project, we'd like to wish you a lovely evening. Thank you so much, Goethe, for hosting us here on Zoom tonight, and kwaheri, everybody from Nairobi.
Bye,
and from London.
thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.